Commander James Barrett knew he was in trouble the moment his ship's quantum drive started making sounds no quantum drive should ever make. The Starship Odyssey's warning systems blared as the vessel tumbled through uncharted space, far beyond the regulated lanes of the Terran Alliance. "Computer, status report," James shouted, his fingers dancing across the holographic controls. The artificial gravity fluctuated, sending loose items floating momentarily before crashing back down. Multiple system failures detected. Quantum containment at critical levels. Emergency protocols engaged. The computer's voice remained eerily calm as chaos erupted around him. James had been leading a deep space reconnaissance mission when an anomalous energy surge knocked his ship off course. Now he was being pulled toward an unmarked planet, its surface a tapestry of emerald forests and sapphire oceans. Beautiful, but completely unknown to Earth's star charts. The ship's hull groaned as it entered the atmosphere, plasma streams dancing across the viewports. James activated the emergency landing protocols, but the controls barely responded. The ground rushed up to meet him, a vast canopy of giant trees growing larger by the second. "Computer, send emergency beacon," he commanded, strapping himself into the crash harness. The response was lost in the thunderous impact as the Odyssey plowed through the massive trees, each collision slowing its descent until it finally skidded to a stop in a clearing. Silence fell, broken only by the hiss of cooling metal and the gentle patter of rain on the broken hull. James hung suspended in his harness, checking himself for injuries. Besides some bruises and a cut on his forehead, he seemed intact. The same couldn't be said for his ship. After freeing himself, James gathered what supplies he could salvage: a survival kit, his service pistol, and a portable quantum communicator. The air outside was breathable according to his sensors, so he pushed open the emergency hatch and climbed out into an alien world. The trees around him defied belief. Their trunks were wider than skyscrapers, stretching hundreds of meters into the sky. Bioluminescent fungi dotted their bark, casting an ethereal blue glow through the mist. The very scale of everything made James feel like he'd shrunk. The ground trembled. At first, he thought it was an earthquake, but the rhythm was too regular. Footsteps. Something massive was moving through the forest. James ducked behind his crashed ship, drawing his pistol more for comfort than any practical purpose. The footsteps grew closer, and James's jaw dropped as their source came into view. A woman, but unlike any he'd ever seen. She stood at least 60 feet tall, her skin shimmering with a subtle iridescence that seemed to shift colors in the dappled sunlight. Her features were striking yet human-like, with high cheekbones and eyes that glowed like amber. She wore armor crafted from some kind of crystalline material that caught and reflected the forest's bioluminescence. She wasn't alone. 2 more giant women emerged from the forest, each carrying spears that could have served as radio towers back on Earth. They moved with impossible grace for beings of their size, barely disturbing the smaller trees around them. "I found the star vessel," the first woman said in a voice that resonated through James's chest. The language was unknown to him, yet somehow he understood it perfectly. "But where is the pilot?" James weighed his options. Running seemed pointless. Their stride could cover more ground in a second than he could in a minute. Fighting was equally absurd. That left diplomacy. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out from behind his ship, hands raised. "I mean no harm," he called up to them. "My ship crashed. I'm a peaceful explorer." The giant's reaction surprised him. Instead of hostility or even curiosity, their faces showed something else entirely: relief. The lead woman knelt down, bringing her face closer to his level. Her eyes studied him with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. At last, she breathed, her voice softer now, but still carrying the weight of command. The prophecy speaks truth. A son of the stars has come. She extended her hand, palm up, in a clear invitation. I am Catriona, first warrior of the Titanides. You are safe here, star son, but you must come with us. Our queen awaits, and time grows short. James looked at the offered hand, then back at his ruined ship. The reasonable response would be to refuse, to try repairing his vessel and calling for help. But something in Catriona's voice, an urgency tinged with hope, made him reconsider. Besides, his survival likely depended on understanding this civilization and its people. He stepped onto her palm, his heart racing, as she carefully lifted him to shoulder height. I'm Commander James Barrett, he said, struggling to maintain his composure as the ground fell away below him. Of Earth. Earth, Catriona repeated, testing the word. Your arrival was foretold, James of Earth. You carry within you the key to our salvation. She began walking, her movements so smooth he barely felt the motion. But first, you must understand who we are, and why the stars have brought you to us. As they moved through the massive forest, James couldn't shake the feeling that his crash landing was more than just an accident. Something had drawn him here, to this hidden world of giant women, and soon he would discover exactly why. The journey through the forest seemed to stretch for hours. James stood on Catriona's palm, watching in awe as they passed between trees that dwarfed even the giant women. The forest canopy far above filtered the twin suns' light, creating ever-shifting patterns on the ground below. Finally, they emerged into a vast clearing, and James felt his breath catch in his throat. Before them stood a city unlike anything he'd ever seen. Massive structures were built into and around the giant trees, connected by bridges of crystalline material that sparkled in the sunlight. Waterfalls cascaded down from various levels, their spray creating permanent rainbows in the air. But what caught his attention most was the enormous temple at the center, its spires reaching toward the sky like fingers of stone and living wood. Dozens of giant women moved through the city, all of them stopping to stare as Catriona and her companions passed. James noticed their expressions, a mixture of hope, wonder, and something else, desperation. Welcome to Luminara, Catriona said, her voice filled with pride despite an undercurrent of sadness. The last city of the Titanides. They approached the central temple, its entrance flanked by statues of male figures that matched the women in size. James noticed how warm these statues looked, as if they'd been touched countless times by reverent hands. Inside the temple, the air hummed with energy. Strange symbols carved into the walls pulsed with a soft blue light, and the floor was inlaid with spiraling patterns that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of his eye. At the far end of the vast chamber sat Queen Thalia, and James understood immediately why she ruled. The queen stood even taller than Catriona, her presence commanding attention. Her hair was the color of starlight, flowing past her shoulders like a river of silver. She wore a crown that appeared to be made of living crystal, and her eyes held the wisdom of centuries. Catriona knelt before the throne, carefully holding James at eye level with the queen. My queen, I present James Barrett of Earth, the star son who crashed upon our shores. Queen Thalia leaned forward, studying James with those ancient eyes. So small, she murmured, yet I sense great strength in you. Her voice carried both power and gentleness. Do you know why you are here, James Barrett? No, Your Majesty, James replied, standing as tall as he could. My ship was damaged and I crashed, though I'm beginning to suspect it wasn't entirely an accident. A slight smile touched the Queen's lips. Indeed, nothing happens by chance in these waters of space. She rose from her throne, gesturing to a nearby priestess who carried forward a large crystal sphere. Within it, images began to form: stars, planets, and what appeared to be streams of energy connecting them. "Our people once ruled this sector of space," Thalia began, her voice taking on the rhythm of a well-worn tale. "We were builders, explorers, creators of wonders. Our men and women stood as equals, our civilization a beacon of harmony." Her expression darkened. Then came the void plague. The images in the crystal shifted, showing scenes of destruction and death. A weapon created by our enemies, the Shadowborn. It targeted only our males, killing them within days. We fought back, drove the Shadowborn from our worlds, but the damage was done. Every male of our species dead. James watched as the images showed the devastating aftermath. "But surely there must have been survivors. Some way too." "None," Catriona interjected, her voice tight with old pain. "The plague was thorough. And worse, it left a lasting curse. Any male child born to our women since then has died within hours. For 3 centuries we have endured, but we are dying. Our numbers dwindle with each generation." The Queen moved closer, and James felt the weight of her gaze. "But there was a prophecy, spoken by our last seer before she passed. She spoke of a man from distant stars, whose blood carried the key to our salvation. A human whose genetic structure could resist the lingering curse and help us rebuild." "Me?" James's voice cracked slightly. "But how can you be sure?" "I'm just a military commander, not some prophesied savior." Thalia smiled fully now, and James was struck by how it transformed her face. The prophecy spoke of specific signs. A crash of metal and fire, brought down by the ancient beacons we left in space. A warrior who leads others, yet carries compassion in his heart. She gestured to his uniform. "Even the stars on your collar were foretold." A priestess stepped forward, carrying an ornate bowl filled with swirling liquid that glowed with the same blue light as the wall symbols. "This is the waters of truth," Thalia explained. "If you are truly the one we seek, your blood will sing with it." James looked at the bowl, then at the faces around him. Thalia's serene confidence, Catriana's barely concealed hope, the priestess's eager anticipation. He understood now why they had brought him here, what they were asking of him. It seemed impossible, yet he couldn't deny the pull he felt, the sense that this was where he was meant to be. "If I am who you think I am," he said carefully, "what exactly would be required of me?" Catriona stepped forward. "You would be honored as a savior of our people. Those among us who wish to bear children would seek your blessing. Through ancient rituals and our advanced genetic science, your essence would be used to help create a new generation of Titanides." "And if I refuse?" "Then you are free to leave. Once your ship is repaired," Thalia said softly. "We are not barbarians, James Barrett. We do not force destiny's hand. But know that with you dies the last hope of our people." James took a deep breath. The rational part of his mind screamed that this was insane. He had a career, a life back on Earth. And yet, hadn't he always felt like he was meant for something more? Something extraordinary? He looked at Catriona, noticed how she wouldn't meet his eyes, as if afraid to influence his decision. There was something there, a connection he couldn't explain, but couldn't deny either. "I'll need time," he said finally, "to understand your people, your ways, to be sure this is the right path." Thalia nodded, seeming pleased. "Of course, Catriona will be your guide. She will show you our city, teach you our history." She turned to Catriona. "Take him to the stellar gardens. Let him rest and consider what he has learned." As they left the temple, James noticed Catriona's hands trembling slightly. "Are you all right?" he asked. She glanced down at him, surprise flickering across her features. "You are facing the weight of an entire civilization's future, yet you ask about my well-being. It seems like a lot of pressure on you too, being my guide." A small smile touched her lips. "Perhaps the prophecy was right about your compassion." She paused at a magnificent structure built into the trunk of an enormous tree. "These will be your quarters. Rest now, James Barrett of Earth. Tomorrow, I will show you wonders that will help you understand who we are and why the stars chose you." As James settled into his surprisingly comfortable chamber, scaled perfectly for his size within the larger structure, he couldn't help but feel that his life had irrevocably changed. Outside his window, the twin suns were setting, painting the sky in impossible colors. Somewhere in the city he could hear singing, haunting, beautiful voices raised in what might have been prayer. He thought of Catriona's face when she spoke of her people's future, of Thalia's ancient eyes filled with hope. "What have I gotten myself into?" he whispered to the alien twilight. The only answer was the continued song of the Titanides, calling to their gods, or perhaps to the stars themselves, asking them to finally end their people's lone loneliness. Dawn broke over Luminara with an ethereal beauty that still took James's breath away. The twin suns painted the crystalline bridges in shades of amber and rose, while the morning mist created halos around the towering trees. But he had little time to admire the view. Today marked the beginning of his trials. Catriona arrived as the second sun cleared the horizon. "Are you prepared, James?" Her voice carried a note of concern. No human had ever tempted the ancient trials of worth. "As I'll ever be," he replied, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Though it might help if I knew what these trials involved." "There are 3 tests," she explained, lifting him carefully to her shoulder where a small platform had been crafted for him. "The trial of mind, the trial of heart, and the trial of spirit. Each will challenge you in different ways." She paused, her voice softening. "No one would think less of you if you chose not to." "I'm doing this," James interrupted firmly. The past week, exploring Luminara, had shown him the quiet desperation behind the Titanides' proud exterior. Their civilization was slowly fading, and he couldn't walk away from that. The first trial took place in the archives, a vast chamber whose walls were lined with crystalline memory matrices containing the accumulated knowledge of the Titanide civilization. The archive keeper, a stern-faced giant named Vestra, waited for them. "The trial of mind tests wisdom and understanding," Vestra announced, activating a central crystal pedestal. "You must navigate our history, experiencing key moments through the memory crystals. But beware, lose yourself in the memories, and your mind may never return." James was connected to the central crystal through a delicate circlet placed on his head. The world dissolved around him, replaced by vivid visions of the Titanides' past. He saw their civilization at its height, magnificent cities among the stars, ships that dwarfed Earth's largest vessels, and the harmony between male and female that had been their foundation. Then came the darkness, the Shadowborn's attack, the devastating plague, the death of their men. James felt their pain, their rage, their despair as if it were his own. But through it all, he maintained his sense of self, analyzing, understanding, learning. Hours later, he emerged from the memories, shaking but enlightened. Vestra's stern expression had softened slightly. "You maintained your identity while absorbing our history. Few have managed both. You have passed the first trial." There was no time to rest. The trial of heart awaited in the hanging gardens, where massive flowers bloomed between the walkways. Here, Catriona left him in the care of the garden keeper, a gentler giant named Lyria. The heart knows truth that the mind cannot grasp, Lyria said, leading them to a pool filled with luminescent liquid. This pool reflects not your physical form, but the truth of your intentions. Step in, and we shall see what lies in your heart. James entered the pool, and immediately the liquid began to glow brighter. Images formed in its surface, his hopes, his fears, his doubts about the task before him. But stronger than all of these was something else. A genuine desire to help, compassion for the Titanids' plight, and growing feelings for. The liquid suddenly blazed with blinding light. When it dimmed, Lyria was smiling. Your heart is true, James Barrett. You seek not power or glory, but the chance to make a difference. The second trial is past. The final trial began at sunset. The Temple of Spirit loomed before them, its ancient stones humming with power. Queen Thelia herself waited at its entrance, along with Catriona and a gathering of Titanid priestesses. The trial of spirit is the most dangerous, Thelia warned. You must face the essence of our people's curse itself. Many have been driven mad merely trying to understand it. Inside the temple's heart, a dark energy writhed within a containment field, a sample of the very plague that had destroyed the Titanid men. James would have to demonstrate that his spirit, his very life force, could resist its influence. As he stepped toward the field, Catriona moved forward. My queen, please. This is too dangerous. We can find another way. Catriona. James's voice was gentle but firm. I have to do this. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something passed between them. An understanding, a connection that transcended their physical differences. The containment field lowered. The dark energy surged toward James, surrounding him, trying to corrupt his life force as it had done to countless Titanid males. Pain seared through every cell of his body. But James stood his ground. He focused on everything he had learned, the Titanids' history, their courage, their hope. He thought of Catriona's face when she spoke of her people's future. Slowly, his own life force began to glow, pushing back against the darkness. The energy recoiled, unable to corrupt him. More than that, where his energy touched the plague, the darkness began to transform, becoming something new, something healing rather than destroying. As the trial ended, James collapsed, exhausted but alive. Catriona caught him gently in her hands, cradling him close. Her eyes shimmered with barely contained tears. 3 trials, 3 victories, Queen Thelia announced, her voice ringing through the temple. But you have done more than simply pass them, James Barrett. You have shown us something we have forgotten. That darkness can be transformed by the light of a willing spirit. Looking up at Catriona's face, seeing the mixture of pride, relief, and something deeper in her expression, James knew he had made the right choice. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever obstacles they would face in saving her people, they would face them together. Rest now, Catriona whispered, her thumb gently stroking his arm. You have earned it, my brave star son. As she carried him back to his quarters, James realized that somewhere during these trials, Luminara had stopped feeling like a strange alien city. Looking at the towering trees, the crystalline spans, the proud faces of the Titanid women, he felt something he hadn't expected. He felt like he was home. The peace following James's trials lasted barely a month. He had begun working with the Titanid scientists, combining his human genetics with their advanced biotechnology, when the warning came. Massive ships had appeared in the system. Shadowborn vessels, returning to finish what they had started centuries ago. "They must have detected your crash landing," Catriona said, her face grim as they watched the approaching ships from Luminara's defense center. The massive holographic display showed at least a dozen warships, each large enough to shadow a city. James studied the tactical display. "Is military training kicking in?" "Your defenses." "We have shields around the city," Queen Thalia replied, "but they were designed to hide us, not withstand a prolonged assault. Our weapons are defensive only. We lost much of our military technology with our men." James straightened. "Then we'll have to improvise. Show me everything you have." What followed was a desperate race against time. James worked with the Titanides to repurpose their peaceful technology into defensive systems. The crystalline bridges became energy conductors. The memory matrices were modified to project false targets, and the ancient temple's power source was converted into a shield generator. The Shadowborn struck at dawn. Their ships breached the atmosphere like angry gods, their weapons firing indiscriminately at the forest canopy. But Luminara was ready. The first wave of attackers found themselves tangled in holographic duplicates of the city, their weapons passing harmlessly through false targets, while the real Luminara remained hidden. When they finally located the true city, they faced an ingenious defense system that turned their own energy weapons against them. James coordinated the defense from Catriana's shoulder, using his combat experience and the Titanides' technology in ways neither species had imagined. Crystalline spears became guided missiles. The forest itself was turned into a weapon as massive vines entangled enemy ships. But the Shadowborn pressed their attack. A blast breached the Editor defenses, destroying one of the ancient tree towers. Catriona shielded James with her hand as debris rained down around them. "There's one way to end this," James said suddenly, steadying the enemy flagship. "Their command ship. It's the same design that carried the original plague. If we can capture it." "We might find a cure," Catriona finished, her eyes widening. "But reaching it would be suicide." James met her gaze. "Not if we work together." The plan was audacious. Using modified transportation crystals, James and a team of Titanide warriors teleported aboard the Shadowborn flagship. While the giants engaged the enemy directly, James navigated the ship's smaller corridors, making his way to their biological weapons vault. What he found there changed everything. The Shadowborn hadn't just created a plague. They'd been trying to manipulate Titanide genetics to create super soldiers. The plague had been an unintended consequence, one they couldn't control. More importantly, James found their research data. Combined with his own unique genetics and the Titanide's biotechnology, it held the key not just to preventing the plague's effects, but to reversing them entirely. The battle ended with the Shadowborn retreating, their flagship captured, and their forces scattered by the unexpected ferocity of the Titanide defense. But the real victory came in the months that followed. Working together, James and the Titanide scientists used the captured research to develop a treatment. Is human DNA, naturally resistant to the plague, provided the foundation. The first successful birth of a male Titanide in centuries came 3 months later. Standing in the nursery, looking up at the tiny giant baby, still larger than James himself, Catriona's eyes filled with tears of joy. "You did it," she whispered. "You saved our people." James shook his head. "We did it together." He paused, gathering his courage. "Catriona, I need to tell you something. The treatment, it had an unexpected side effect. The genetic modifications, they're changing me. Slowly, but—" She looked down at him, noticing perhaps for the first time that he stood slightly taller than before. "You're becoming like us." "Partially." The scientists say I'll never reach full titanide height, but—" he smiled up at her. "Let's just say the size difference won't always be quite so dramatic." Catriana's laugh was like music. "Then I won't have to be quite so careful when I do this." She gently lifted him to her face and pressed a tiny kiss to his cheek. 1 year later, Luminara celebrated. New life filled the city. Male children played in the gardens again, their laughter mixing with the songs of their mothers. The Titanide civilization was reborn, stronger for its near extinction, wiser for its suffering. James stood on a balcony of the temple, now nearly 15 feet tall himself, watching the twin suns set. Catriana joined him, no longer having to kneel to speak with him. "Any regrets?" she asked softly. "About staying?" He took her hand, still smaller than hers, but now large enough to hold properly. "Only that it took a crash landing for me to find my way home." Above them, the stars began to appear, the same stars that had guided him here. But now they weren't just distant lights. They were a promise of a future where humanity and Titanides would explore them together, their strengths combined, their legacies intertwined. In the nursery below, their own child slept peacefully, the first of a new generation that would carry the blood of both worlds. The prophecy had been fulfilled, but more than that, it had been transformed into something greater, not just the salvation of one people, but the beginning of something entirely new. The song of the Titanides rose into the night, but it was no longer a lament. It was a celebration of life, of love, of the endless possibilities that lay ahead. And James Barrett, once a lost star son, now a bridge between worlds, added his voice to the chorus. The end.